then because of the virtual situation that we're in, so we can get awesome people like Reshma and Bradley to chat with us. If you're interested in learning more about these events, I will paste a link to our page in the chat and my email. If you are interested in sort of volunteering and organizing it, we're pretty like volunteer run, and we get to put on cool things that we're interested in learning more about ourselves. So.
Good to meet you. And I, at this instant in time, am a visiting partner at Y Combinator, and in the past have started 2 startups in healthcare. One radiology startup called MedXT, which was acquired by Box, and then a lab testing at home startup for insurance applications called Droplet, which is now kit.com. And I think that I wanted to go a little bit into background for why we did this event. In a previous, last year, I was one of the co-chairs of the startup track for CNC, and we would get like a lot of inbound email and messages to the startup track with the following requests. 1, I'm interested to work at a startup, but I'm not sure how to pick the right one, which is a very legit concern. 2, I want to advise startups, but I'm not sure how to start. And 3, I want to invest in startups and I'm not sure how to start. So those were like really common questions that we would get into the requests and feedback from people who attended startup track events in the past. And that's the origin of this this event. And I do see some familiar faces, so hopefully this is gonna be helpful in discussing openly about doubts. I think there isn't a lot of discussion, out in the open, I think, about startup advising. So I'll caveat to say that like these things are my opinions and things that I have seen, and Bradley will also speak from his experience. I'll introduce him in a moment, but it's not like there's really rules per se, but just wanted to share some experiences and also have a lively discussion. We'll do about half of the content of this today's talk as questions from the group if you have any. But to kind of tee everything up, I actually hate the word advisor. Like, to me, that I get this visual of someone sitting on a stone bench near an olive tree, talking to another person, like a la Plato or Aristotle giving advice. And that is actually not typically what I've seen for advisors in early stage startups. Advising in the early stages of companies can be a very active process, like helper would probably be a better word. And I think some of the things that I've seen advisors do, I'll give specific examples that are absolutely true. 1, getting a payment account unfrozen, finding a pathologist who has licenses to work in 50 states, so a telemedicine company can get up and running, interviewing and selling any type, lots of candidates, like troubleshooting DevOps problems, getting a payment account fast-tracked in a regulated industry, negotiating the sale of a domain. So these are things that I've seen, and also, help, mental support and encouragement for a CEO or executive team. Like, these are all common things that I've seen startup advisors do. And it's like a very active and visceral feeling. It's much less. I'm also on the board of University of Nebraska-Lincoln, like a educational board, and that is much more like talking and giving advice and kind of the non-active portion. And to compare and contrast, like startups have a very active feeling, and kind of nonprofit boards or educational boards, et cetera, have more of an advice flavor. So that's just kind of reflecting on that. In general, I see kind of 3 kinds of advisors, and general business advisors, successful business people with business skills, domain experts, and scientific and technical advisors. So I'll give a few comments on that I've seen. For general business advisors, these people are typically investing in a company. And it's kind of rare that startups get a lot of value from like a general business advisor who doesn't invest. So if you're kind of thinking about, if you are a general business person and are thinking about advising a startup, unless you're like writing a lot of code or investing, just have some caution that you may actually be hurting that startup if they list you as an advisor and you don't actually invest or write a lot of code or do something extremely functional. Sometimes first-time CEOs don't know that, and they run into trouble when they're fundraising. Who is this advisor? They have not invested. What does that signal? Blah, blah. The second is domain experts. So a domain expert is like a kind of advisor that will like lift the profile of the company and help them raise money and get credibility that a startup typically doesn't have. So one example of a domain expert advisor that I've seen is like a precision medicine company. They had a former FDA assistant commissioner as their advisor. So they're on the kind of cutting edge of this new regulatory boundary, and they have someone with extreme credibility to like speak to that. Another example is like there was a consumer lending startup and they had a banking executive that like helped them raise a bunch of debt, things like that. And the third type of advisor that I've seen is some scientific or technical advisor. These are typically like hard tech startups, like where there's a lot of doubt about whether the technology could be developed at all. And in that case, having like a world-class scientist to help guide through that frontier is a common pattern for advisors. So that's kind of some of the tracks that I've seen. And in that spirit, I want to introduce our other guest, Bradley Horowitz, who has kindly agreed to join us. So say hi to everyone. Bradley has been an advisor to many companies and is currently VP of product at Google for the last decade and has led dozens of Google's consumer-facing products. And he's an educator, Cornell Tech Fellow, and serves on corporate boards, so Singtel, List, several nonprofit boards, including the Effortless Mastery Institute, and is an active angel investor, including like some that are no longer startups, like Slack and Dropcam, Grab, NerdWallet, and he can talk about some of his other investments as well. So really seasoned. I think he would qualify in many of the categories, maybe all three of the categories that we discussed before, but yeah, join me in giving him a warm welcome. And let's see, should we just launch into it? Maybe I'm gonna ask Bradley some questions for a few questions, and then we will open up to discussion from the audience, okay? Sound good, everyone? Lost anybody? All right, everyone's still here. So Bradley, welcome. We're so super glad to have you. So to kick it off, you're an important person at a huge company. Why do you take time out to advise companies?
Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me. Second of all, you need some fact checking. I am an unimportant person at an enormous company. And I'm not entirely joking. I did run a bunch of Google's products for many years, but about 4 years ago, I downshifted and took on a couple of more fun jobs. The first was opening an incubator within Google called Area 120, which is designed to create spin-ins, things that we create and reabsorb inside of the company. And I ran something called Google for Startups, which is like the most fun job in the world. It's basically Google dumping resource into communities around the world, like in Sao Paulo and Seoul, Tel Aviv, Warsaw. So I got to sort of fly in, shake hands with the mayor, kiss a baby, and go home. So that's what I've been doing for the last 4 years. Very unimportant, but someone has to do it. And now I've actually downshifted further into an advisory role, which means when Google needs help, and I can help, they call me and I do anything I'm asked. So not important. And part of this downshifting into this more advisory role at Google was specifically to give me more time to do extracurricular things like help companies. And so part of why I do it, First of all, I'm of a generation, you know, I was an entrepreneur myself and made every mistake possible, and, you know, then got into a big company, Yahoo, and an even bigger company at Google. And I feel like if the hard-earned knowledge that I've gained dies with me, that's like criminal. Like, the best thing I can do is sort of impart it to people who can make different mistakes instead of bumping into the same, you know, mistakes that I made. So part of it is just being fortunate enough to be at a moment in my life where I feel like if there's anyone that will listen, you know, I have sort of an obligation and duty to sort of share what I may have learned along the way. Another part is that I am angel investing along with my wife, who is also, she was an electrical engineer and became a designer and ran design at Netscape, Yahoo, and Google. And she's now at Khosla Ventures, a venture capital firm. And so she's like more experienced in investing, but we angel invest together. And as Reshma said, a lot of the advising is really around the investing. So we will write a small check that wouldn't pay for an engineer's salary for a year, but it aligns our interests. It sort of gets us on the cap table and connected to the company and sort of inside the company. And as my friend Tony Fidel says, we pay them to take our advice, basically. It sort of gets us close enough that we have their ear close enough that we can sort of whisper into it. And so a lot of the advising and investing, we sort of think of as one thing. You know, we sort of do this to be helpful. And as you pointed out, there are so many ways to be helpful. It's not as if I have a curriculum that I sort of march a founder through. A lot of it is reactive. Right now, I have about 70 investments and even more companies that I'm affiliated with, either on the board or otherwise. So there's no way I can sort of touch every company on a weekly basis. So a lot of it is, you know, call me when you need something, and the onus is sort of on the company to engage. But that's why I do it. I try to be helpful. I try to find investments in companies where either I can be helpful and or learn something. So some of these are way out of my wheelhouse, but you know, as we've learned at Google, sometimes it's okay to take someone with no experience and sort of drop them into the deep end of the pool. And, you know, sometimes they'll have an idea or two that wouldn't have otherwise occurred to the domain experts. So that's my motivation. And I have to say it's good times. I'm having a lot of fun doing this and hopefully providing some measure of help back to the companies.
So when you mention like reactive, do people come to you with like really bad problems, or what's the nature of the questions and things they reach out to you for?
Oh, just as you said, it's from the sublime to the ridiculous. I mean, on the ridiculous, there is a fair amount of therapy that goes on, just sort of like, is this even a company? Am I, you know, an imposter? Like, what, like, is real? You know, just people needing some validation and calibration as to what's going on because everyone else is crushing it, you know? So they just need a shoulder to cry on or a reality check. And sometimes the right answer is, no, this isn't a company. This is a hobby. I hope you're enjoying it. And, you know, you have to sort of be brutally honest and deliver the news that they need to hear. That's part of being a good advisor, and a helpful advisor is to sort of really reflect back your impressions. A lot of it at my level, and I think this was included in some of what you did, being a veteran and out here in Silicon Valley since '95, and with my wife also in the industry, we know a lot of people and we're affiliated with a lot of different firms and companies and things like that. So one of the most useful things we can do is be a connector, which is a very low level of effort for a high return usually. You know, sometimes it's just making opt-in, double opt-in email introductions and things like that, especially as startups are marching through their Series B and C and, you know, fundraising especially. So yeah, but it ranges the gamut. And I think I could create a list like you did, which is, you know, everything from therapy to, you know, legitimately, there are increasingly few areas where I can give technical advice, but, you know, I try to seek those out. And so my background's in computer vision. So I was just talking to a company that is trying to automate some logo detection. And so that was a case where I had a little bit of experience in that domain and was hopefully helpful.
So what kind of connections do you make? Is it mostly like investors? Do you help people make sales? Like,
yeah, it can be sales. I'm shameless. I'll help with that. I have to believe in a win-win for both sides. Like, I am just not into spamming people. And so I need to be sold first and convinced that, that connecting, like one of the companies I'm connected with is called Miro. They do sort of a digital whiteboard. And another company I'm connected with is Slack, the enterprise messaging product. And those things belong together. They need to talk to each other. And so the CEO of Miro asked me for an intro to the CEO of Slack, and I was only too happy to make that introduction. And they had a great old time. And there's a bunch of integrations underway now. And, that was a case where I was a believer, and it was just a delight to facilitate that connection. But there are other times where, they can't even get me over the line. So, I'm shameless. I sort of protect my integrity and reputation more than I just, try to be helpful at all costs, because I don't believe in a scorched earth strategy of advising.
totally. No, that was a haymaker question, because this is about one of the most helpful things that I've seen advisors do. Say you have like a young enterprise company, they have a product that, they're not pros at selling it yet, but because you advise the company and like what it does and how it works, you can map in your mind as the advisor who a good first customer might be. And those first few sales for those companies are absolutely crucial. And it can be a really high value interaction, hopefully for both sides, usually for both sides, if you're kind of thoughtful about it. So that seems like it's something that top advisors really do a good job about. And ever done a first sale, Bradley?
There's an example of something I'm proud of investing in. It's a company that built these little dongles. I actually don't have one, but I do have a quarter. It's about the size of a quarter. They're adhesive, and the idea, it was called Pregnancy Coach. A pregnant woman will wear one of these dongles, and it will stop her from sleeping on her back or her stomach and encourage her to sleep on her side, which improves blood flow to the baby and reduces birth defects, improves birth weight, and all these other wonderful things. And it's, a simple device. It's got an accelerometer and, a little bit of circuitry. It's not complicated, and it vibrates. They've found that they can actually get someone to readjust without waking them, so it doesn't disturb your sleep. They realized sort of a month into the pandemic that about the only thing doctors knew to do for COVID patients was called proning, which was to get them to sleep in a prone position. And so they changed one bit in the firmware, and now an anti-prone device was a prone device. And it has the additional advantage that today, if a nurse or orderly has to go in and rouse and touch and readjust the patient, that exposes them to, potentially COVID. And so this was sort of self-serve. They can put it on the patient, back away, and they can prone themselves. So when they sort of pivoted Pregnancy Coach into what's called Mini Proner, I went all out, and I basically, did a LinkedIn search, and I discovered I was connected to people in hospital systems. And, I sat in those meetings, even though I had very little to offer. I mean, I've exhausted my knowledge about what they do in describing it to you pretty much, but I just wanted to lend my support and sort of lurk in those meetings. And so, LinkedIn is a wonderful thing. I've been very promiscuous. They say on LinkedIn, only accept connections from people you know. What's the point of that? I accept connections from people I wish I knew or ought to know. So, it's worked for me very, very well, except when Google recruiters are, I see you know so-and-so. And I'm like, I actually don't know so-and-so. They're just, connected to me from 8 years ago when I said yes. But anyways, I really did a sales job for them because I thought the cause was so just and important. So, yes, I will do that on occasion.
I mean, it does. I always think about it when I'm on the receiving end of somebody saying, oh, I want an intro for this. I'm like, oh, they convinced so-and-so who I know to be an advocate for them. So that's like also another signal that speaks to the quality of the company and the sincerity of the founders. So that's
Totally.
awesome.
Yeah.
Maybe we could take us also on a little bit of a biographical journey. Like, you were a founder, and then you've, worked in big companies for a few years, and over that same time, like, tech has exploded. Can you maybe comment on like the founders for your company and the difference that you see between then and now?
I mean, how much time you got? I could sit in a rocking chair and tell stories. And I think most of you, some of you are from my generation, but like what people don't remember is when I'm a PhD dropout. I was at the Media Lab. I got my master's and started the PhD program. When I dropped out, like we were so clueless. You couldn't just like launch YouTube and get 10,000 videos on lean startup methodology and how to build a pitch deck and how to talk to VCs. We didn't even know how to spell VC. We didn't even know where Silicon Valley was. And so we drove to California. My company had 4 founders, and we drove to California, and we actually landed in San Diego. We didn't even know we weren't in Silicon Valley for about 18 months. And then we caravaned the whole company up to San Mateo. But the real lesson, I think the most important lesson I learned in founding a company, especially one that was out of MIT and highly technical, we were sort of high on our own fumes and expected that if we just sort of commercialized our research and hung a price tag on it, the world would beat a path to our door. And to just tell you a little bit about Virage, the company that I founded, it was sort of advanced video analysis. We did face recognition, speech recognition, optical character recognition, scene segmentation. We built video databases. The problem was that in 1995, you couldn't actually click and play a video on the net. Like it was like 10 generations ahead of what the market actually needed. The market needed YouTube, and we were building all this YouTube 10.0 stuff. So I remember I was in New York City at ABC News in the dungeon, like the basement of ABC News building at Upper West Side. And we had just pitched the news organization on our technology, and they were intrigued. But at the end of the meeting, I was left in the room packing the cables up and stuff like that. And an engineer came over to me and said, you know what we really need? And I said, what? He said, a Perl script to upload the file to the CDN. Can you write me a Perl script like that? And I said, yeah, but that would only take 5 minutes. And he pulled out a chair and I sat down and I took the 5 minutes and I wrote the script. And because of that script, we won them as a customer. And more importantly, a little dopamine hit went off in my head and it felt really good, like to actually build something people want. And Paul Graham, MIT alum, Y Combinator founder, has a t-shirt. It says, build something people want. It's so obvious. But those of us who, spend years pursuing degrees and are highly technical, we forget that. And instead we build what intrigues us or what grants us fame and respect from our peers. And, so that lesson came really visceral to me. And, again, it's so common knowledge. Most 13-year-old tech-oriented kids know this now, minimum viable product, and the whole process is sort of well-worn and well understood. But for me, it was a revelation, to actually start with the customer's needs. Later on, you can add differentiation and your own technical agenda as a great moat and spice to that problem. They came to appreciate what we wanted. You sort of have to give them what they want, so they want what you have to give them. But that to me was sort of the main difference between then and now, is sort of we had to learn all of that the hard and slow way. And now I think a lot of people read the Cliffs Notes and get that right out of the gate.
Whoa, so much to unpack there. I think Bradley might have invented the Collison install before there was a Collison install. So for those who don't know, Colson install, it's a thing that like refers to Patrick Colson at Stripe, and he would like, when onboarding customers, just go to their computer and like onboard them because just to like get people started. And a lot of first-time founders don't realize the inertia that customers have to like get on board. And sounds like Bradley did the same thing for his company.
This might have been before Patrick was born, so I think I can lay claim.
Great. Heard it here first. Awesome. I mean, maybe we could switch gears a little. Like, if you're a founder, seems like there's several in this group as well. Like, what could you do to better leverage your advisors, or in your case, advisor investors, and get more value out of the relationship?
Well, my answer is to be proactive and remember to call on them in the right context. Here's some beautiful music.
Could we get somebody to
to use them. I mean, they're a resource that you have either paid for in equity or time or whatever, and so it's up to you to sort of reach for them as a tool when they can be appropriate. The other thing I would say, and it's something I remind companies of all the time, I don't have all the answers. I may not have any of the answers. I have my own experience, and you should take it with a grain of salt and map it to your experience. And if there's any wisdom in there, that's great. And if you ignore me entirely, that may be the right answer. And so, like, a lot of things change. And so, the experiences I have, I don't want them to constrain people. And I've had people, outright defy my advice and, do the right thing. And time is said, they were right, I was wrong. And that happens enough, you get humbled. So I'm always happy to offer the advice, but I offer it as advice that people should take or leave. And another thing around that, just advice for advisors. This is a personal story, but I remember a friend of mine was getting married, or was on the verge of proposing to his wife. And he said, "What do you think about me and so-and-so?" And I said, this is a time for honesty. And I basically said, something, I actually don't see it. I don't think you're a good match. I don't think you belong together. And I think you're making a big mistake. And about 3 months later, I was at their wedding, wishing them well, raising a glass, so he ignored my advice. I turned out to be right in the sense that 6 years later, they were divorced and, wasn't a great match. But one thing I learned is it's better to give people a framework. Like, it's what I'll do in helping somebody think through a problem is not give them an answer, but help them tease out the trade-offs, the ledger. If you prioritize this, you'd choose this way. If you prioritize that, you'd choose the other way, and really let them make informed decisions, but sort of call out things they may have missed and help them with that framework. So I'm done dispensing answers, and my advice more takes the form of framework.
I mean, that completely makes sense. If there was like a rubric to build $1 billion company, then I do believe that there's no really generic, obvious advice that
right
makes a lot of sense.
A question actually about that story, and it relates to startup advising. That is basically, here's a guy who's making an emotional decision as opposed to a rational one. And I remember my first girlfriend, my father gave me a whole list of reasons as to why I wouldn't like her, but said, "God damn, Dad, just look at her." And it turns out she's beautiful, and it turns out, and it was basically an emotional response. And the same thing was true about my startups that I did. A lot of times you're going on and running on adrenaline and hormones to go on and get stuff done. And you can think and you can do, and generally doing requires energy and emotion, and thinking, it's not nearly as much fun. Going on and to get on the advisor side, getting these guys basically to back off the emotional side, which has basically been driving them all the way, and moving them to the rational side. Any suggestions on how to do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're exactly right. One of the nicest things about being an advisor is that you can be a sounding board. You're sort of, you have some skin in the game. You want the success of the company and of the person. But like I said, I also tell people when I think they're being delusional or emotional or whatever, like that is the value we provide, is that we're not so inside the walls of the company that we've drank the Kool-Aid and, you know, we've bet the farm on it and we're so invested that we can't face things. So I think you're exactly right in the sense that it is our obligation as advisors to sort of be sober and, you know, 1 foot inside, 1 foot outside, and you know, rational. And these frameworks are designed to sort of get them out of the realm of emotion and, you know, impulse and into a way to sort of assess choices that may lay before them. So, I mean, that's a really good point. To a degree, any good founder is passionate to the point of delusion, right? That's one of the ingredients that all the great crazies have. But when it comes time to make decisions, I think it's often important to sort of give them that rational grounding.
Totally makes sense. And I'll have one more question for Bradley, and then we'll open it up to questions. Because there's like 100 people in the Zoom, it would be actually great if we could type the questions into the chat. I think that would just let us keep a little bit faster flow, more questions. But okay, one more final question. You started Area 120. What's the difference between advising and incubating / spinning in, like you referred to before?
Okay, pretty different. You know, the idea behind the internal Google Incubator, we buy 30 companies a year at Google. Some of them are giant things like Nest, and you'll hear about them. Most of them are smaller, and, you know, only if it's in your radar will you hear about it. Some are even acqui-hires, you know, where we'll bring on 10 great talented people in a domain that we care about. The experiment here, when we do buy these companies, there's sort of a few costs we incur. One is dollars. We actually pay venture capitalists huge amounts of money to sort of, you know, buy out the cap table. And, you know, that's okay. We have plenty of money. That's not so hard. The harder part is that often when we buy a company, the first thing we do is put a silly hat on them, welcome them to Google, and then throw out everything they've done and start over. And that's because our infrastructure is pretty unique. An example that was very painful was Google Voice, where we not only had to throw out what they built, but our data centers weren't really ready for telephony. So we had to do a lot of other work to just get the networking infrastructure, telephony ready. And then when we launched Google Voice, there was this collective groan from the world because it was a regression from the product that we had actually bought. Like people were saying, it's taking so long, they must be doing something great. No, it was pretty modest. And we launched it and people were annoyed. But that is not an uncommon story. Often we buy something and then we go dark for months as they learn our infrastructure, port the code over, and we're sort of back up to the plate 6, 9, a year later. The third reason is that founders often bounce. I mean, some bounce angrily and, you know, dramatically. Others sort of leak out the company after they've vested a bit. But, you know, that's, we pay a lot for that talent. And a lot of times what we're getting or hope we're getting is that talent, that DNA to sort of enhance what we have at Google. And it's a shame when things don't work out. So the thought experiment with Area 120, which is this internal incubator, is let's keep doing 30 acquisitions a year, but for 31, 32, and 33, could we build something that we think Google might need a year from now ahead of the need? And we'll do it cheaper, so that's good. But more importantly, we'll build it on Google infrastructure. And then third, we'll have Googlers build it so that the risk of them bouncing on the culture, you know, this is built by Googlers who know that the only successful outcome is more Google in their life. Like they're doing this because they want to stay at Google and continue working at Google. And so we launched that about 4 years ago. We've had dozens of products. We haven't landed on a Instagram or WhatsApp scale success story, but we have quietly moved the needle in ways that have accounted for major successes within Google. And so these are quiet things. They sort of spin back into Google. And then the leaders on that team, the founders, take leadership roles on those teams. And so the model is working and growing within Google. And we've had to adapt a bit due to COVID and what I would call an environment around big tech that is mostly like everybody just don't move, don't say anything, don't do anything, which is hard for a project which is trying to innovate and test boundaries and, you know, create. So it's a tough environment for radical innovation inside of a big company, but we have adapted and I think it's going very well.
I mean, true respect. I think that trying to harness that creative energy, there's no formula for it really, but keep on trying things, and like there will obviously be some losses, but some wins. I think as a founder whose company was acquired, if you look carefully, you see like a lot of people everywhere who have started companies and have been reabsorbed, and they're now like in a role in product or engineering or even sales, or running their own P&L, and their entrepreneurial skills can be put to good use in the right environment. So
yeah,
that sounds great.
Reshma, I actually want to plug one of the things I did was start teaching at Cornell Tech, and it was Dan Huttenlocker, who's now running the AI lab at MIT, but he was the former dean of Cornell Tech who drew me in. We were both on the visiting committee of the Media Lab. And what he realized is there's a lot of rhetoric and courseware on startups now. As I said, you can launch YouTube and watch 10,000 videos, but there's very few on like how to be successful and entrepreneurial inside of a big company. And the truth is, the goal of every entrepreneur is to get big, either to do that independently, like Google did, or Slack took it pretty far. Now they're part of Salesforce, or to, you know, do an acqui-hire and sort of get absorbed, or you die. There's very few sort of, you know, successful smaller companies. I think Basecamp would be a good example of one, you know, but it's sort of go big or go home. And so I teach a course at Cornell Tech on big company innovation, and we talk about things like incubators, we talk about Xerox PARC, we talk about Innovator's Dilemma, we talk about corporate M&A and corporate venture, things like that. And I co-teach it with Chad Dickerson, who is the former CEO of Etsy, who's an old friend of mine. And yeah, I think it sort of doesn't get the respect or sort of airtime it deserves, but most entrepreneurs at some point on their journey will either create a big company and need to know this, or will be absorbed by a big company and need to know this. Yeah,
I mean, I think Stripe will be excellent material for your course if you just look at who's on there in their team. Yeah. I think that they have actually done a really phenomenal job, and Google has some great folks as well. I can't remember the gentleman who leads Google Photos, but he is
David Lieb from Bump.
Yes, yes.
So he's a Y Combinator alum, and yeah, he's fantastic.
Fantastic. Okay, let's open up to questions. I'm just going to, for the interest of time, read from the chat. But is there a path to becoming an advisor if you haven't run your own startup before or are not an industry expert? Good question. So I'll comment briefly here, and Bradley, feel free to jump in. So I think question one is like, do you have a relationship with a CEO who's running a good company that you like to advise? You know, there's a little bit of a cold start problem. I'll tell you from being a CEO, if I ever were to like take on an advisor, what would have appealed to me? I was trying to get my first contracts. And I was, you know, learning how to sell a product that was not perfect. And if someone was like, oh, I am general person who messaged me on LinkedIn that was like, you can sell into my company, they need your product, I would have really thought about being that, letting that person be an advisor. So I think there's like opportunities like that. I'm not saying that you should spam people, but if you see companies that you think like could really be useful at your company, or you have a special way that you could help. Early stage CEO, if you message them, I bet they would read your message. So that's kind of a thought. Do you have a thought there, Bradley?
Not beyond what you said, which I think is great advice. And, you know, I think at the end of the day, you have to have something to offer. you know, and I've never been a CEO. So there's a lot of advising that I'm not helpful with, Reshma, you've been a CEO, so you can help with that part of the journey. I've been a CTO and, in a corporate wonk, but I can't really help you there, so, but we all have, our strengths and probably some wisdom to impart in some area. And so you just have to see if you can figure out a match there.
Yeah. And Ed, one more final comment I'll put in that is that you should be prepared to invest if that's the case. Like, it may not need to be a huge denomination, but sometimes that can blindside people. All right, from Greg Harmon, what's the courting process like for smaller under the radar deals from Google, from unknown to Google acquisition?
I would say the only thing that is not well understood is the amount of sway that a champion has. Like corp dev, their job is like mostly procedural and logistical. So some companies get excited because Google corporate development is called them. And it's true, they do execute the transactions, and they're sort of the lawyers and deal team. But unless you have a business champion, and by business, I don't necessarily mean revenue. It can be a technical champion. In fact, mostly for Google, it is sort of a technical champion, either a tech lead or a PM or something like that. And in some ways, it can't be too high in the organization. You actually need like someone who is on the ground, who's basically saying, I can't live without this. And I desperately need this. You need that level of advocacy to move a deal through Google. So that is sort of the secret that I think people don't fully understand, is that it's not really about corp dev and the mechanics of the deal. That's in some ways turning a crank. It's about getting some stakeholder at Google so excited about your startup that life without you is unthinkable. And when you've got that in your pocket, things happen.
And Greg, I'll plant one more idea in your mind. Sounds like Google might also invest in tooling to move from other cloud providers to Google. Is that correct, Bradley?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's all kinds of incentives when you're third in the market. We're willing to talk about anything.
No, I'm just teasing. You were mentioning your infrastructure, migrating your startups to your infrastructure. So
yeah,
that is not good advice. All right. From Eric Anderson, invest and have skin in the game. So you're motivated to advise, creates better situation and relationship, then join the board of advisors and get stock options. This is an interesting one. Okay, so first of all, a very early stage company typically doesn't have a board yet. Like if they're just, a few people and they've raised convertible debt and stuff like that. So joining the board doesn't really exist, or it might be just one person, the CEO and maybe a chairman. And so that is really probably the entry level for folks who haven't done advising before. And so, yeah, it's not really a choice. As far as I've seen commonly, when a board is being formed, actually the board also often consists of investors who have, participated in your round. So that's also another aspect. What kind of realistic expectation should a founder have as an end goal? Hard to evaluate this question without knowing your own life goals. I'll maybe provide a few comments of things that I've seen from my peer group, like having started a company around the same time. I think there's like a few paths that sometimes founders take. Like they start out as they want to build $1 billion company, and they're working towards that, and then they kind of learn about their problem in the space, and some decide to like turn a business into a more lifestyle business. Some decide to wind it down. Sometimes some decide to sell the business. So there's like actually very many paths that people go on. I don't think that there's really a formula to say that you're definitely going to become an enormous company. that formula truly doesn't exist. But so it's hard to set expectations that that would happen. But I'm not sure if that was helpful at all. Bradley, anything to add here?
I mean, you can't control the outcome, but you can control the journey. So having a high integrity experience with people that you've curated and that you enjoy being around, and an experience where you learn a ton, like shame on you if you don't get that out of the experience. You can't promise a unicorn or decacorn or going public or anything like that. There's just too much the world has to say about those outcomes. You can't will those into existence. But there is a lot you can do to make the journey something you're always proud of and something value add in your life experience. So I would say try to focus. The realistic expectations are the ones that manage those.
Yeah, totally agree. So from Harpreet Singh, what kind of financial option agreements do you recommend for domain experts and scientific experts? So here, for domain experts and scientific experts, let me tell you something definitely not to do. So for an advisor who's like a scientific expert, say they're a professor or something like that at a university, you don't want to like have 15% of the company and not work at the company full time. That's really going to hurt the company that you're trying to help. Because when they're going to like raise more capital, they'll be like, who's this person on the cap table? They don't work full time. What's going on with this? It'll put, and then that there'll be further on questions. This person's a professor. They're not leaving their job. What does that say about the prospects of the company? You just don't want to get there. I mean, a very low amount of equity, you know, something like in the 0.1 or 0.5% range. I've seen things like that. This is for an advising case where you have not invested, I'm presuming. So you know, that's a discussion, a specific discussion for a specific circumstance, but just wanted to kind of give bookends ideas along those lines. Let's see. And Bradley, you have like lots of experience with this. Does that kind of resonate with your?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think like one important thing is like, don't take cash. like that is, you know, fuel for your startup. And so please don't let them pay you. Take equity. Reasonable expectations are fractions of a percent. You're not a founder. You're spending hours, not your life, invested in this thing. So, you know, be reasonable about that. There are tax implications and 83B filings, and like you've got to actually be careful about some of this stuff because you may end up with taxable events if you're not. Usually most mature startups, you know, like by the time you're getting to Series B and things like that, have formalized this and can shove a piece of paper across the table at you as like, this is how we work with advisors. But just, you know, you're going to want, I'm not here to give tax or legal advice and couldn't, but, you know, talk to people who can and make sure you're not creating taxable events. Or if you are, you're managing them well.
Those pesky taxable events.
Yeah.
Okay, from Brad Ito. What kind of conventional wisdom about startups do you disagree with? Oh,
so here's one for me. I hate the meme of the sort of cowboy, unless the investor is fighting for food at the table, they're not going to be successful. I just sort of hate like desperation is a feature. One of the entrepreneurs I really love is Ev Williams, who created Blogger, which Google bought, Twitter, which Google didn't, and Medium, you know, and so he's a 3-time, you know, these are companies of major consequence. And he's not doing this because he's desperate or has anything to prove or, you know, he's doing this because this is what he does. He's a machine that creates these great ideas and has the resource and know-how to sort of build them. I call it like intrinsic motivation as opposed to sort of trying to, you know, impress or achieve something in the eyes of others. And so like, I actually think, you know, you absolutely have to work hard and passionately, probably harder than you ever have in your life. So like, I'm not against hard work, but I am against sort of like desperation and delusion and the sort of toxic mental illness that is attendant with that stuff. So, you know, so, and people feel differently. There's big debates on Twitter amongst people I respect on both sides about, you know, can a startup be successful without that? But I come down squarely on, you know, not being mentally ill is a feature.
Yeah. I just have like a couple of brief sound bites on that topic. I think the growth at all costs, I think is, you know, you need to have like a methodical thought towards your growth and not just like grow, grow, grow. That's kind of one counterintuitive one. And the second is raise as much money as you possibly can. That one, I think, you know, seeing adverse effects to that as well. So, Anvisha, have you worked with a startup where one of their advisors gave them bad advice and it led to tangible negative impact? Yes.
Well, I have a story about.
Yeah, story.
I have a story. I'm not going to out anyone in particular, but I'll tell you a story about impedance mismatch, which I think is one of the big problems. So I just pasted a link into the chat of an investor in my startup 20 plus years ago was this business legend named C.K. Prahalad. And he was a professor at the University of Michigan, wrote a book on core competence, was an advisor to Bill Gates. And, you know, like, and as I mentioned, the founders of my startup were pretty clueless. And my professor, Ramesh Jain, who was a co-founder, basically said, CK will solve all the business problems. And so it kept building up. Like finally, we were going to get our audience with CK, and we had this dinner with CK, and you know we had a litany of problems that we expected him to build, and so to solve for us. And so finally, we got our audience with CK, and we sat down and said, well, first of all, like we can't get our product in front of customers. And, you know, we could barely finish the sentence. And he said, by God, man, the marketing department has to, and he sort of went on a rant, and we sort of said, there is no marketing department. It's just us, you know, like, and it was like that for every single problem we had. You know, he started railing, you can't let the lawyers, we don't have any lawyers, you know, it's just us, you know? And so it was clear he was operating at a level where he was moving departments around and, you know, with Bill Gates, and he just had no clue what a 5-person startup felt like, or, you know, later on, you know, 3 years later, he was helpful. So, but like, I think this impedance mismatch where, you know, people are just not fluent at the level your startup's at can lead to bad advice, or more likely just completely irrelevant advice that you can probably spot it when you see it.
Totally. So I also don't want to out anyone with the bad advice comment, but this is one thing that I've seen as a pattern that is something that I think all advisors should think about, is that like entrepreneurs come to a problem with their own journey and their own motivation. And I've seen particularly like advisors who are very energetic and they have a lot of ideas, and they kind of project their own motivation onto the startup and like try and steer an entrepreneur away, but it's like off their trajectory. So they're kind of getting them off track. I'm describing this super abstractly, but that is actually a recipe for problems. Like I've seen an advisor very passionate about a certain healthcare population telling an entrepreneur to go after it because they can see that their product might work for them, but that, you know, that wrong initial customer fit can really, you can turn a lot of time on it. So that is something that can be quite tangible, and, you know, months are years for startups and can be a detour. As an advisor, do you help to ad hoc requests or certain goals and milestones? Do you have a regular cadence? So in my case, there are a couple of startups that I advise where I do have a regular cadence. Usually these are folks who are building out their engineering org, and like they don't want to bring on, you know, executives yet, but they want to have some mentorship for some of their key employees to like help them with their progression. that's typically the milestone and goals that require a constant engagement, but would not be a full-time commitment. And then a lot of ad hoc requests, crazy things happening, regulatory changes, accounts getting locked down where can be helpful. What about you, Bradley?
It's really the same. I would say I have a few standing meetings with people I have a great connection to, like a monthly, usually not more than monthly one-on-one, where we keep up a cadence of checking in, and it's partly coaching, partly advising, partly mentoring, there's that kind of thing. But for the vast majority, it's like one-offs. I wake up and I look and there's, just different inbounds where I can help, I do, and where I can't, I tell them. And, so it's much more asynchronous.
Yeah, totally makes sense. So team, we are actually at time. So I want to thank you all for joining us today and for asking all these awesome questions. I'm also going to pre-ask Bradley if he would like to do a session sometime on how to be entrepreneurial within the enterprise. I think that would be awesome for this this group.
Sure.
Great.
Yeah.
And let's see. In the spirit of LinkedIn, I'm happy to connect with people. If you could just remind me in the messages that we met in this forum, that would be great. And maybe I can think about whether I want to send a startup to you to try and sell your company on some software or something like that. All right. Great to meet everyone. I'm going to be online for a few more minutes. But this will wrap the portion of the talk that's official. So.
Bye. Thank you.